Puya, the man, the myth, the possible offender, he's definitely a known name in the underground scene who's partially responsible for the rise of many artists that we now know and love, like Killswitch, Suicide Boys, and his day one homie, Fat Nick, who is the actual topic of today's video. But since these boys are so closely connected in many ways, it's hard to talk about one of them without talking about the others. But right now we gotta get into the sidekick of Puya, brother, partner, I'm not really sure what you would call him, but either way he's a very interesting character in the underground scene himself, so let's look into the story of Fat Nick. Nicholas Fassino was born September 6, 1994 in Miami, Florida. During his younger years, he was into the regular stuff that most kids like video games, skateboarding, and of course, food, which is where the nickname Fat Nick came from. Although at the time during middle school, Nick was actually pretty skinny, and that was due to the fact that he really loved skateboarding and would even attempt to do it professionally at one point. And it was through his love of skateboarding that he would meet his best friend, Puya. Basically, he was at the skate park one night, he decided to jump over a fence, unfortunately got caught on it, and ended up ripping his pants. And then one of the kids there started laughing at him and filming him on a flip phone, and that guy happened to be Puya. Now, I'm not 100% sure how this formed a friendship, but apparently it did, and after that, Fat Nick and Puya would be inseparable for the following years. Now, at this point, both Fat Nick and Puya were pretty bad in school. They wouldn't show up to class. When they did, they didn't pay attention, and overall, they would describe themselves as scumbags during this period, just kids who wanted to have fun, wanted to go crazy, and didn't actually want to try, which is pretty common at this point. Almost every single Florida rapper that I've talked about has the same backstory, but these guys did it a little bit before everybody else. But seeing as how this was around 2012, there wasn't really the idea of being a SoundCloud rapper back then. The only rappers that they knew were people in the area or people that were played on the radio, so instead they decided that they wanted to be YouTuber comedians. They started a series called The Nick and Puya Show, where basically they do comedy skits, go into malls, and do stuff that they described as jackass-like stunts, but overall it's basically just a bunch of kids in the area walking around and doing dumb things, really nothing to it. Although this series would help to introduce them to people like Ruben Slick, Mike Dean, and other early SoundCloud rappers from around the time. Overall, though, it was pretty unsuccessful. It didn't really gain them any views, it didn't give them the fame that they were looking for at the time, but despite that, for some reason, they still decided to drop out of school in grade 10, with Puya immediately picking up a job as a busboy at a local restaurant, and Fat Nick going on to sell candy to everybody in the local area, which his mom was surprisingly cool with. At first, she definitely wasn't happy that he was selling candy, but after a while, she would get more used to it and actually help him with it. And when the cops showed up one day, she even hid all the candy in the closet so they couldn't find it. So Mama Fat Nick is definitely taking one for the team on that one. However, this lifestyle wasn't very sustainable long term, and with Puya being fully fed up with buzzing tables and YouTube not picking up any steam for them, they decided to give rap a shot, with Puya dropping his first song ever called Shots from the Double Glock, which had a feature from an artist named Neil of Raider Clan, a local underground rap collective headed by Space Ghost Perp, also being notable for including Denzel Curry. Now, there's a lot of history to this group, but honestly that's a video all on its own, so I'm not going to talk too much about them, but all you really need to know is that they were a big deal in Florida in the early 2010s, and they really helped Puya out early on. Although Puya would say they didn't really do anything for him when it came to rap, he was only friends with them and they didn't really do anything to put him on, but it's kind of debatable one way or another, but I would say they definitely did help a little bit. Anyways, getting back to Fat Nick, he didn't start making music until 2013, dropping his first mixtape called Buffet Boys, which would later become the name of their rap collective with both Puya, Fat Nick, Mikey the Magician, and a couple others, with the meaning behind this name basically being that they were both eating good because they were making enough money off of rap so they could eat the good stuff. But I feel like Fat Nick was always eating the good stuff even before he got famous, hence why he's called Fat Nick. Okay, no, but for real, I'll stop with the fat jokes now, let's move on. Anyways, getting back to the mixtape, it actually included a feature from Mikey the Magician, a friend of theirs from the local area that would eventually take on sort of a management-like position in their careers. Basically, he was the money man, he would help them book shows, he would help them make merch and everything they needed to do to actually make a profit, because at the time SoundCloud didn't really pay anything and they weren't putting any music on Spotify or Apple Music, because back then artists saw it as kind of disrespectful to try to get money off of their music. I'm not really sure why, I guess it was because they were underground, punk, and hardcore, but either way, eventually they would start making some big time profit. At this point, Puya and Fat Nick were going around doing shows in warehouses with about 10 fans in the audience at the time, but even though they weren't really picking up any traction in the local Florida scene. They would start to gain traction on SoundCloud, with the app getting more and more popular by the day, and with only a few people on there making music, it wasn't long before they started to gain an audience. And with the type of music that Puya and Fat Nick were creating at the time, known as dark trap, being more popular in Memphis than Florida, it wasn't long before they gained a fan base completely out of the state that they were currently living in. In 2014, Nick would drop his next mixtape called The Heart Attack, as well as going on tour and performing alongside people on Team Sesh. So Nick was definitely forming up some good connections that would help him out in the future, but at the same time, he would also form up a habit for sipping grape juice while he was on this tour, with one of his collaborators introducing it to him. And after all, Fat Nick is the type of dude who really likes food, he likes sugar, he likes candy, so a drug that basically tastes like grape soda is definitely going to be right up his alley. So naturally, it quickly became an addiction for him, and after that, he would suffer with the effects throughout most of his career. Now, during the first couple years of Fat Nick and Puya's career, there's really not too much to say. They're basically building a fan base bit by bit, getting more fans with every show they did, because that's basically how SoundCloud used to work back in the day. You would drop song after song after song, gaining more fans, touring around, getting to meet them, and it was a very underground movement. It was really only when Lil Pump came into the scene and then blew up with one song that people started to think of SoundCloud as something that could get you into the mainstream. But before that point, most artists who liked SoundCloud heavily rejected the mainstream, not wanting to be an artist that was signed to a big time label, and Puya and Fat Nick definitely fit into that as well. So they were basically only celebrating really small time victories, like getting 1,000 plays on a song, getting 10,000 plays, and then eventually they got their big breakthrough moment when they got on No Jumper, although it was still pretty small time because they're only the second people to ever appear on that podcast. Because back in the day, Adam 22 was only known for interviewing people from the BMX community, but after interviewing Xavier Wolf, he realized there was a lot more money to be made by interviewing underground rappers, so immediately after that, he would get both Puya and Fat Nick on there to talk to them as well. Although Puya had a lot more to say than Fat Nick, because at this point, Nick was already heavily invested in drinking grape juice, so he seemed like he was half out of it, but during this time, it was socially acceptable to be half out of it on an interview, so you can't really blame him, and it seemed like it was a good first impression for both of the boys. And besides just getting more exposure on their music from No Jumper, they were also able to meet Suicide Boys in person for the first time. At this point, Puya was already working with them on their tape Southside Suicide, but he had never met them in person before, so you can definitely look back on this time as a very important moment in the underground scene, with both of them going on to become big time and eventually working together on Grey Day. But getting back to Southside Suicide, it's kind of interesting because at the time, Puya was definitely the bigger of the two artists, but after that, the Suicide Boys would then blow up and become even bigger, and he's been known to do this with many different artists, including Ghostmane and eventually Killswitch as well. It's basically how Puya keeps himself relevant in the underground, because at this point, most people aren't really checking for his music anymore, but if he works with another big upcoming artist in the underground scene, he can put a cosign on them before they get big, and then after that, people can say, you know what, Puya made that guy famous. After that tape drop, Fat Nick would also drop another project called Fat Camp, which included more features from Mikey the Magician, Puya, Eddie Baker, Team Sesh, and many more, with them ending off the year 2014 by opening for Travis Scott, which sounds very, very impressive, and don't get me wrong, it is, but keep in mind he wasn't really a big deal at this point, with him only really blowing up a couple years after this, but it definitely was a big get no matter what. By 2016, Fat Nick would drop his next project called When the Lean Runs Out that included features from the Suicide Boys, Shakewell, and a new upcoming artist named Lil Peep. And if you watched my videos in the past, then you already know that shortly after this, he would go on tour for the project and take along with him Lil Peep as well as Smoke Perp, being the first time that either one of them went on tour, so in a way, Fat Nick was kind of guiding the younger generation of SoundCloud rap. Although he did guide them in somewhat of the wrong direction, because don't get me wrong, Lil Peep was definitely drinking grape juice before this tour, but once he got on tour with Fat Nick, the resident grape juice enjoyer, he definitely started to drink it a lot more and formed up his own addiction to it. However, despite that, Nick and Peep would become pretty close friends and would continue to do shows and make music together in the following year, with the final ever recorded song by Lil Peep actually being made at Fat Nick's house, so you could see that they were pretty close all the way up to the end. Now, at this point in 2016, Fat Nick was a pretty big deal when it came to the underground. Not everybody knew who he was, and he definitely wasn't popping in a mainstream type of way, but he was a name that you often heard, and his music was definitely doing numbers. But after that, he would drop his biggest project to date alongside Puya called Drop Out of School, which became a pretty big hit for them on SoundCloud, although once again, it wasn't really a mainstream hit. Although one funny thing about this project is they actually took the cover art at Killian High School, the very same high school that they dropped out of when they were 16 years old, so you could see that they came a long way since then. And after that mixtape drop, Fat Nick would then head on a European tour where he would hit many different cities, get to meet fans, and run his bag up even more. But it was when he finally got back from that tour during 2017 that he would really start to find infamy within the mainstream. Because we all know at this point, Lil Peep ended up passing away on November 15th, 2017, but what some of you might not know is that on November 1st, 2017, he would meet up with Fat Nick, and Fat Nick would give him 100 Advil and 50 Tylenol. Now, I'm saying the names of these drugs differently because, of course, YouTube doesn't really want me to say what they really were, but if you know the stuff that ended up taking Peep out, that's what it was. Which in the following years after Peep passed away drew a lot of scrutiny to Fat Nick because, after all, supplying that many pills and then having all of them be gone in 15 days definitely showed that Peep was in a really bad place by the time he passed away, and it seemed like Fat Nick was enabling him. Now, I'm not really sure how to feel about the whole witch hunt that took place after Lil Peep passed away. I definitely don't agree with people going after all of his friends and calling them out, but if you were going to blame anybody, I feel like Fat Nick definitely had the biggest hand in giving him that many drugs. But at the same time, Lil Peep is a grown man who's able to make his own decisions, so you can't really blame him overall, but he would gain even more infamy for everything he did after Peep passed away. With him immediately getting a crybaby tattoo on his forehead, before then recording a music video for his track Stay Alive featuring Bexy, which was meant to pay respects to Pete, but within the video you can actually see him sipping grape juice, which a lot of people saw as disrespectful after his friend passed away. And that really goes to show just how far gone Fat Nick was at this point, because he was getting more and more addicted to the stuff. It didn't seem like he could stop, and he was in complete denial about the fact that he was gaining weight and looking more sickly. And it even got to the point that when Fat Nick appeared on a Montreality interview alongside Puya, Puya would then call him out and say that he was gaining a lot of weight and looking very unhealthy, but that fell on complete deaf ears because Fat Nick wouldn't be stopped at this point.
I care for my health. I think I'm healthy.
Bro, you're not fucking healthy, bro. You're 1,000 pounds and do lean,
I'm like
bro.
three.
I mean, like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist
This thing,
to
it's like,
know that you aren't healthy. I'm not healthy either, bro.
it's just a touchy subject to care about. Yeah. Do I want to stop?
Immediately after Pete passed away, Fat Nick would do an interview talking about him, and this is basically where the whole Pete fanbase split off between people who want to side with the label and people who want to side with Peep's friends. Bexy and Macnam were looked at as the devil and like they actually killed Peep. Then you had people like Lil Tracy and Coldheart who were looked at as saviors, and then Fat Nick fell somewhere in the middle. A lot of people didn't really mind him, but they also saw him as a bad influence, and Fat Nick would basically side with Bexy, Smoke-a-Sack, and all the guys that were handling the legacy of Little Pete. Meanwhile, people like Tracy and the rest of Goth Boy clique were basically getting cut out, and even more controversy would pop up after a track called Falling Down featuring XXXTentacion and Little Peep came out, and basically a lot of people around Peep saw this as disrespectful because apparently he didn't like X. The first person to come out against the song was one of the producers who worked with Goth Boy Click named Fishnark, who went on Instagram Live to say that Peep didn't like X whatsoever, he never would have got on the track with him, and the fact that the label was putting it out was very disrespectful.
He explicitly rejected Triple X for his abuse of women, spent time and money getting Triple X's songs removed from his Spotify playlist, and wouldn't have co-signed that song.
But Fat Nick disagreed with this, saying that Peep actually had plans to go meet X after the Come Over When You're Sober tour ended, but unfortunately he passed away right before they got a chance to meet.
You know when Peep died, Peep was in GBC. That's the crazy part. When he died, he was in GBC, and he stayed at my house 5 days before. Check the tour dates. Crazy. I was one of the last people to talk to him. Go check his bio, see if GBC's still there. It all started way back when all that clothes got stolen from Ski Mask, you remember? That was when people took that shit, and they resolved that. Because people never did that shit. But it was someone in Peep's camp, old camp, that did it. So don't correlate scumbags with Peep. I have a song with Peep that X wanted to jump on too because X loved Peep's music. I have that text message that X wanted to jump on the song that I have with Peep that's unreleased. X loved Peep's music. So y'all coming saying they had beef. No, that beef didn't start like that. That beef started when clothes got stolen from Ski Mask by someone in GBC. And then that person in GBC blamed it on Peep.
And a lot of people took Fishnark's side, but Fat Nick might have actually been right about this. I talked about this more in my Mini Beast a Little Peep video, but there's a lot of evidence that Peep never really had a problem with X in the first place. But either way, the general consensus was definitely more on Fishnark's side, and they were seeing Fat Nick as somebody who was lying to get attention. With him even appearing on No Jumper a second time alongside Bexy and DJ Scheme to talk more about Peep and X, which pissed people off even more, but it's pretty clear he was only trying to pay respects to his fallen friend. But there's basically no reasoning with the Lil Peep fanbase during 2017. They thought everybody was the devil and that everybody had to go down. And even Lil Tracy would take a shot at Fat Nick, blaming him for giving Peep all those Tic Tacs and candy before he passed away, which definitely is a valid point. Fat Nick would then fire back, and they went back and forth a little bit on Twitter before then taking a picture together later on to show that they are now on good terms. And I know a lot of people are going to say if Little Tracy had a problem with Fat Nick, it means that Fat Nick was actually bad, but you got to keep in mind that Little Tracy basically went after everybody after Pete passed away, including Juice WRLD, X, Little Pump, Bexy, DJ Academics. He was basically going through a bipolar episode after Pete passed away and lashing out at everybody, so you can't really take it too to heart. But either way, Fat Nick's reputation in the Lil Peep community was definitely taking more and more of a hit as time went on. And if all of that wasn't enough, Fat Nick also had a part to play in the whole Smoke Perp versus Russ situation, because he was the first one to call out Russ after he wore that t-shirt that was making fun of Lil Peep, and then immediately after that, Russ would fire back. He'd call out Fat Nick for advertising grape juice to his very young, impressionable audience, with Fat Nick firing back saying that he wasn't trying to advertise it and he was only talking about lean because that was the addiction he was fighting at the time, and he didn't want kids that were going through the same thing to feel alone. But then Russ would fire back and say you sold t-shirts that had grape juice on the front of them, so you're definitely profiting off of drug addiction. And at that point, it seemed like Nick had to concede, basically apologizing to his audience for whatever part he might have played in advertising any form of drug addiction. And after that, Fat Nick would start to go on a better path, losing a little bit of weight and trying to get off the grape juice once and for all. And then he would finally finish off the year by dropping the project that he was recording when Peep was at his house in 2017 called Generation Numb, which had features from OGZ, Black Bear, and Bexy. Now at this point, Nick would stop dropping projects for a couple years, possibly because the Peep fan base was getting too rampant and angry and he kind of wanted to step behind the scenes to get away from that, or maybe it's because he wanted to take a more management-like role, with him and Puya starting up a record company called All But Six that basically replaced the Buffet Boys. And along with that new project would also come a YouTube channel where they'd post music for any artist that they were messing with, even if they weren't signed to the label, and one of these people was Tay-K, with his infamous video, The Race. Now, I probably should make an entire video on Tay-K because after all, this is one of the most infamous moments in SoundCloud history, as well as the entire hip-hop community taking notice of what he did. But to sum it up, Tay-K was on house arrest. He ended up cutting off his ankle monitor and running away from the police, and during the time that he was on the run, he would shoot a music video for his track The Race, which was all about how he was running away from the police. A lot of people were surprised that it was posted on All But Six because they felt like there was no crossover there whatsoever, but according to Fat Nick, Tay-K was going to fly out to Florida to meet up with him and sign to the label. Not really sure if that's true. I'm starting to see a pattern of Fat Nick saying that things are going to happen after the person themselves can't speak on it anymore because Tay-K ended up getting life in prison and Pete passed away, so it seems like he might be lying, but it could be true as well. Soon after that video dropped, Fat Nick was able to turn his life around, losing 50 pounds while he was doing the keto diet, as well as finally quitting grape juice and moving out of LA once and for all to return to Florida, living alongside Puya and Killswitch. Now, unlike other rappers who lie about getting sober, I truly do believe that Fat Nick actually got off the drugs, because if you look at him now, he definitely looks a lot more healthy. You can see that his skin looks better, and overall, it was good for his career, because ever since he's moved back to Florida, he's been able to focus most of his effort on working on his craft and less on distractions, and in 2020, something very odd happened to the underground. You see, the Suicide Boys were always very popular from 2016 to around 2020. They definitely had a hardcore fan base, people were tuning into their music, and they were getting a lot of streams, but they weren't really well known on a grand scale. But during 2020, one of their songs would get popular on TikTok, and after that, almost everybody started to find out about them. Their fan base got way bigger, and they signed a huge deal, as well as putting on a show every year called Grey Day. Before this point, they had Grayscale, which was still a pretty big festival, eventually morphing into Grey Day, but after 2020, it got big enough to the point that if you can appear on the roster, you're basically underground royalty. You got people like Cemetery appearing there, you got City Morgue. This is also how City Morgue got a lot bigger, as much as people don't want to respect that. And of course, Fat Nick was there as well. And on top of that, he would also start to appear at another big festival, the Gathering of the Juggalos. And if you know anything about Juggalo culture, they don't just accept anybody to perform at their festivals. They booed off people like Tila Tequila, as well as Chapo, and even Puya was supposed to perform there at one point, but the Juggalos didn't like him, so he wasn't allowed to. But Fat Nick is one of the people who has gotten that approval, showing up a couple years in a row, alongside Sos Mula, who Fat Nick has actually worked with quite a bit in the past couple years. They would make a collaboration track called Street Sweepers, as well as Fat Nick appearing on Sos Mula's album, 13 Songs to Die To, and he probably has the best song on that project. Maybe someday I'll rank them all. And Sos Mula would also appear on Fat Nick's comeback album called Gorgeous Glizzy Gordo, kinda hard to say, which also had a feature from Lil Jerry, which is an artist that Nick was managing at the time. After this point, Fat Nick would drop a more experimental album called Hope You're Proud, which was more punk rock than that Memphis style that he'd been rolling with for years, or dark trap, whatever you want to call the genre, but either way, it seemed like after all this time, Fat Nick was still willing to experiment with his music, which he would continue to do into 2023 when he started to drop country music, or at least country adjacent music, which is usually a flop when it comes to emo rappers trying to transition into that genre, but with Fat Nick, it actually sounds pretty good. And at this point in 2024, Fat Nick is definitely big chillin', living life in Miami, eating good, and appearing on Montreality again to explain his lifestyle changes, bringing along with him a Tim Hortons coffee instead of that grape juice that he usually would drink. And that just goes to show that bullying your friends hard enough will eventually get them off drugs and get them to lose weight, at least according to Puya, but that's a whole different story for a different day, so I'm just going to move on from that for right now. And with all that said, that's basically the story of Fat Nick at this point at least. I mean, unlike other artists that I covered in the past who are basically burnt out and probably won't really do anything all that notable in the future years, Fat Nick definitely seems like he still has a career ahead of him, so maybe I'll do a follow-up video to this in a couple years. But as of right now, it's definitely a story of somebody who grew up being bullied, got into drugs, kind of lost themselves for a while, but he was able to find himself, get out of that addiction, and became a more positive influence because of it. It goes to show that fame definitely does stunt the growth of most people who become famous at a young age, but eventually you can mature and become a better person. I mean, I'm really hoping that Fat Nick is a better person, but once again, when it comes to emo rappers, I never want to say for sure because a lot of them really are deceiving. But either way, I do enjoy his music. He's definitely very charismatic as well. He's got a good personality, and now that he has Killswitch working underneath him as well, I feel like they're going to make some good collaboration music that's going to carry them into the future years. And you can tell that Nick is definitely living the dream at this point because he actually has his own cooking show with Rolling Loud, showing that the fat kid did eventually get to the food at the end of the story. Okay, sorry, one last fat joke. For real, I really do enjoy Nicholas the Obese. Also, I'm kind of tubby as well, so I'm allowed to make these jokes. Shout out to him. Maybe shout out to Puya. I don't know. We'll find out in the future. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel because I'm now trying to get to 16K. That's the next big milestone. I hope you guys enjoyed. Subscribe to that second channel as well. Do Knife in the Pig Game, Pig in the Knife Gang. You know what it is. You already know. But besides that, thanks for watching. Peace.